I also saying thank you to all of you for being here. This is kind of an incredible turnout for a talk like this, so I appreciate it. I'm going to be speaking today to a 5-year ethnographic project that I did with urban explorers in London. I'll come back to talk about urban exploration and who these people are and what they do. But in the second half of the paper, I'm actually at this moment tying up my last publication about urban exploration, and it's about visualization and time. So this seminar is actually very well placed to get some insight into what I'm trying to do here, because it's not working according to the reviewers. So yeah, I guess to give you a bit of context, thank you very much. To give you a bit of context as to why I've been invited to speak in an archaeology seminar series, even though I'm a social geographer. I am a reformed archaeologist. I spent many years breaking my back in pits in different parts of the world, recording petroglyphs. My undergraduate degree was from the University of California, Riverside, where I spent a few years working in the lithic technology laboratory with Phil Wilkie. So I've spent a lot of time making stone tools. And then I worked for some CRM companies in California and in Hawaii. And I spent 5 years working for the US Bureau of Land Management as an archaeologist in a town with about 3,000 people in it. And that was a lot of fun. But it was my master's degree in maritime archaeology at James Cook University that started to push me in the direction of cultural geography. And what had happened is that I went into this maritime archaeology program and told them that I had no interest in shipwrecks. They were all very disappointed. But I explained that I was really interested in submerged prehistoric sites. And I ended up going back to California, where I'm from, and working with a Native American tribe called the Winnemem-Wintu, who had had all of their ancestral homeland flooded by the construction of a dam, Shasta Dam. And so I showed up there with all my kit. I've got my scuba gear, I've got my camera, I've got my underwater housing, and I got to the reservation and found the spiritual leader of the tribe, and I said, "Hey, I'm here. I really would like to dive some of your sites that have been submerged, and I can record these for you, and I can bring back information about the sites." And she said, "Yeah, you can do that at some point. In the meantime, why don't you help us with this?" Right? And this went on for a couple of weeks. And then finally, at some point, I was worried. Like, this is my master's research. I haven't done anything, And I said, "Colleen, you have to help me, get this research done." And she pulled me aside and she said, "Brad, you know what the problem with you white people is? You're obsessed with stuff. Right? You just want to see the things. You just want to touch them. You want to record them." And she's like, "It's like you have a fetish for stuff." And she said, "The thing is, our culture is us. And we've been standing here in front of you for weeks and you haven't asked us anything." Right? So, lesson learned. So that was basically my bridge into cultural geography. So I started thinking more about cultural landscapes, and then eventually made my way to Royal Holloway, where I did my PhD. So I found this. I'd actually like to sort of open this out with a quote by Keith Basso that I think is pertinent not just to that sort of transformation that I went through, but also to this talk. He writes that places possess a marked capacity for triggering acts of self-reflection, inspiring thoughts about who one presently is, or memories of who one used to be, or musings on who one might become. And that isn't all. Place-based thoughts about the self lead commonly to thoughts of other things, other places, other people, other times, whole networks of associations. So that is my starting point for this talk. As we move into urban exploration. So urban exploration, for those of you who haven't heard of it before, is essentially the process of scoping out off-limit sites and cities and sneaking into them to photograph them. So this includes abandoned buildings, construction sites, infrastructural tunnels, subterranean networks, bunkers, abandoned hospitals. The sites are sort of endless. But it was described in the first book on urban exploration, which was penned in 2005, as an interior tourism that allows the curious-minded to discover a world of behind-the-scenes sites. And I think that's a great description of what urban explorers do. In my own work, I've referred to urban exploration as place hacking. And part of the problem that I encountered when I went into this project is that I went into it as an archaeologist, totally interested in dereliction and decay, in the aesthetics of decay, in materiality and time, right? And then I went out with these urban explorers, and the first thing they wanted to do was sneak into a construction site, which made no sense to me. I thought, like, I've done all of this CRM work where I've been sitting on construction sites, so construction equipment. But this guy here, Mark Explo, one of the urban explorers, he said to me, you know, the thing about construction sites is they're just like a ruin, because these are like, this is the real city. It's the city in transition. It's a city that we don't see, right? It's a city in decay, or it's a city being built. It's a city that's that's kept from us, right? Because everything that we see in our everyday life is a veneer, right? It's a facade that very often is a sight to be seen rather than a place to be participated in. And so that's what urban explorers are interested in doing through their kind of recreational trespasses, right? It's about getting behind the facade and trying to get into the inner workings of the city. So in this talk, I'm not going to be talking very much about climbing skyscrapers, sorry, or even abandoned buildings, but I will give you a bit of background to what those spaces are like and why urban explorers are interested in them. This term toads was invented by an explorer in the US called Troy Pava, and it stands for Temporary, Obsolete, Abandoned, and Derelict Sites. It's quite useful. Might want to pick that one up. So a lot of the places that urban explorers initially go into are these sites in decay, and they're interested in seeing the kind of process of the decay of the architecture, and of course of the material artifacts within the building that decay in various ways. And very often urban explorers will come back to these buildings and they'll photograph them over a period of time, so you can actually stack the visualizations and you can see decay over time. And it's a really beautiful process. We also, I was just saying to John that we also do this in construction sites, right? You try and take the same photo from a skyscraper as it's going up, and then you can sort of see the city rising, which is an interesting prospect. But a lot of these photos, a lot of the photos that you'll see on the internet from urban explorers are from Detroit. And we ourselves traveled to Detroit to explore some of these places. And while I was there, we were having a lot of conversations about the ethics of exploring these industrial ruins and derelict sites. There's a great book by Tim Edensor called Industrial Ruins, Space Aesthetics and Materiality, where he writes about the kind of unique phenomenological sensations to be found in these kinds of spaces, you know, the sights and sounds and smells and tactile possibilities on offer in these spaces. But of course, the phenomenological reading sort of misses other aspects of these spaces, right? That there were people connected to them, right? And that those people were affected by what happened in these spaces. And so obviously when I was exploring with my crew, I was kind of prompting them all the time saying, well, you know, what do you think about the fact that there was, you know, a factory worker working in this auto plant, and now this factory worker has potentially lost their job, and, you know, there's actually like a sad history to be excavated here, metaphorically. And I guess, you know, over the course of the explorations that we undertook together in the UK, across Europe, and in the United States, we started to feel kind of guilty about the photographs that we were taking. This was pressured by a publication by John Patrick Leary, an American scholar, who coined this term ruin porn. Right? The idea that capturing the aesthetics of decay in these spaces it sort of fetishizes the misery of others without trying to understand the kind of, you know, the social implications of what was behind capturing these sites. And so, so the crew that I was working with, we essentially decided to come back to London and to try and open up, the city that we were living in different ways. And there's an interesting point here where there's a disjunction between legalities and ethics, right? Because what they saw, what they were doing as a more ethical approach to urban exploration, right? Let's not operate on a traditional notion of exploration where we go out to explore other people's lands, other people's buildings, right? Let's go to our city and let's open up our sewers. Let's open up our infrastructural tunnels. Let's explore our transportation network. But of course, once you start getting into this live infrastructure as opposed to derelict buildings, there's a different sort of legal framework that you're confronting here, right? Transport for London in particular, we're not very happy about some of our exploration, but I'll get back to that. So the crew became increasingly interested in unraveling facets of the city we were living in every day. And about this time, I read this paper by Stephen Graham, where he wrote that the expanding subterranean metropolitan world links city dwellers to giant lattices and webs of flows, which curiously are rarely studied and usually taken for granted. Now, if you think back to that Basso quote, right, where he says, place-based thoughts about the self commonly lead to thoughts of other things, other places, other people, other times, whole networks of associations, right? So these are the things to be discovered in our city. And we eventually found 5 subterranean layers underneath London. And I'm sure a lot of you are fans of stratigraphy, so I'll work through them. So the most shallow tunnels underneath the city are electricity tunnels, GLC pipe subways. This is where we've got all of our telecommunications, fiber optics, gas networks. And if you actually, the next time you're in London, if you walk down the embankment and you look through the grills in the embankment, you'll see these tunnels inside. And then you can try and figure out how you might get in there. It's a fun mental exercise. The second layer, I'm going to skip over. It's the sewers, but I'm going to come back to the sewers, and we're going to spend a lot of time in them for the second half of the talk. But below the sewers, you've got the tube, obviously. 270 stations in the system, 14 of them are abandoned. I think there are 42 that were abandoned in total, but there are 14 abandoned stations that still have some sort of material remains, right? Platforms, ticket offices, something to be seen. So this is Aldwych, probably the best known of the abandoned stations. But we decided to, over the course of 2 years, systematically infiltrate and photograph each one of these stations to create a sort of rigorous form of documentation of these spaces that wasn't being undertaken by authorities. So you can see the crossover here, right? That we've got, say you've got an abandoned psychiatric hospital, right, that was closed down by the Thatcher government. It's been sitting there derelict for 20, 30 years. And you can see where the impetus comes from for urban explorers to go into these spaces and photograph them when institutions like the NHS aren't doing so. They don't have the budget to do so, right? So there's an aspect of sort of guerrilla preservationism here, where the archaeologists are going out the urban explorers are going out to be sort of amateur archaeologists and to do this work on their own. Now, Transport for London, I don't know why they don't do more with these tube stations or make more of these tube stations, but they were not happy that we were photographing these stations and posting the photographs online. And I think that they said it was about security implications, right? That we were indicating to other people that they could access these stations who might have a more malicious intent than documentation. But to be honest with you, the lengths to which we had to go through to get into these stations, I mean, it's just like, that doesn't make any sense, right? They know as well as we do how hard it would be to get into these, how hard it is to get into these spaces, and how hard it would be to do anything malicious in those spaces, given, that you had to crawl through air ducts for 2 hours or whatever. So it seems to me that the more logical conclusion about TfL's frustration is that this is really wasteful. right? That there are these abandoned spaces that could be heritage sites, that could be turned into social housing. You know, there are any number of things you can imagine happening with these stations. And indeed, after we started releasing photographs, all of a sudden these sort of plans started to emerge to build like nightclubs in abandoned tube stations, whatever, which is maybe an unfortunate byproduct of urban exploration. Now, this is really interesting. So underneath the tube, we found this rail system that we thought was the tube, but it had these narrow gauge tiny tracks. And it turned out that it was owned by the post office. It was built in the early 1900s to transport post across London from Paddington to Whitechapel. And it had small trains in there called mini Yorks that would be filled with post and taken across the post office and across the city. And we got into the tunnel system because there were these kind of circular slides that went from the top down to the bottom that would throw the post bags on. We found one of the slides and we slid down and we popped out into that. It's a very exciting moment. And then realized that this thing had been mothballed since 2001 when they decided that the system wasn't economically viable. And the lights were still on down there. And in fact, the trains still worked. They were electric trains. And one of the explorers started the train and drove it about a mile down the tunnel. He described it to me as the most exhilarating moment of his life. Driving down the mail rail, and there was actually, like, going into these tunnels, there were stalactites and stalagmites starting to form. It was calcifying, you know, so you can imagine this thing actually turning into a ruin. You know, it was sort of in early stages of ruination. This, interestingly, after we released these photos, now keep in mind, this had been mothballed for 10 years, right? No one really heard anything about it. We put the photos online, and I think the first 3 days that we had the photos up, we had 3.5 million hits on the photos. And the post office has now announced that they're turning this into a heritage attraction. So, yeah, I don't know. You know, I'm not saying we're responsible for that, but it's kind of interesting in any case. So, on to sewers, and hopefully that makes sense in terms of background. Before I move on to this, are there any gaps I can fill about, does it make sense? The framework of the ethnography, what we were doing, what the motivations were. Is it all clicking in? Yeah.
I'm interested by the word mothballing.
Mothballing?
Yeah.
Oh, right. So it's something that is, it's not abandoned, because someone's maintaining it, but there's also no investment in it. So it's sort of, yeah?
Yeah, that's I kind of got a feel for it, but I just wanted it, yeah.
It's preserved, but it is, it's not.
It's almost like in a state of arrested decay. Sorry?
Mothballing is a term that's being used officially, because with the closure of the steel plant recently, they talk about it being mothballed. It's a process whereby it's not completely abandoned and like sort of disaggregated. It's kept in a certain state where it can be regenerated later. Yeah. So it is a term that's being used now generally.
That's actually a brilliant segue, because the thing that I found really interesting about the sewers is, like, they feel like an abandoned space, right? I mean, they're 150 years old. These sewers are built from 318 million hand-laid bricks, right? There's incredible architecture down here, but no one's down there except for Thames Water workers. And so they feel very sort of haunted. They feel very spectral, even though this is our live infrastructure. Like, the city couldn't function without these sewers. And so I found the sewers, to be quite fascinating spaces. And the imagery that we created in the sewers took more effort than any of the other photos that we took. And yet they're the kind of least recognized. And no one's really interested in seeing the sewer photos. Like this photo. So imagine you've got the camera here. You've got 3 explorers behind the camera. You've got a light down that tunnel. You've got a light behind there. You've got lights behind both explorers, so they're both backlit. You've got the red head torches. And I mean, this whole thing is very carefully engineered, right? There's a lot of work that's gone into that photo. Unlike the mail rail, where you can basically just, take the shot with the lights on. But that's not what gets all the hits. So what I'm trying to work through here is actually a theory from Brompton, this notion of the chronotope or the time space, right? So Bakhtin writes that spatial and temporal indicators are fused. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movement of time, plot, and history. I really like Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope here, and I feel like it bounces quite well off of that Basso quote that I opened with, right? But I'm sort of having trouble connecting it through in a way that people are understanding. So that's what I'm trying to get some advice here on. So Bakhtin writes about the notion of the chronotope in the context of the novel, about how whatever kind of space you create in a novel, it's connected to a time, right? Like even if you're writing science fiction, it has to be connected to a time. It's impossible to escape time. And so the sewers are a space that people assume is kind of timeless. Like it's, you know, like Marc Auger calls these non-places, right? Like no, people don't have a connection to it, right? It's functional urban infrastructure, right? But when we were in the sewers, I felt like we kept encountering time, and like it was actually impossible to escape it. You know, the sewers were actually shot through with it, and the explorations that we were undertaking caused me again and again to sort of go back to the archives, right, to try and figure out what that sort of feeling that was emerging in me, that kind of, you know, that architectural affect that I couldn't really get away from, right? I was trying to go to the archives to tease out what that was. And some of the stuff that I discovered in the archives was really incredible, and that's basically what I want to relay here. So the sewer system was built by or engineered by Joseph Bazalgette in the mid-19th century, and you know this is still the infrastructure that serves us today. He said it was going to last for 150 years, and it has, incredibly. I don't know, you know, we can't imagine Crossrail, you know, lasting for 150 years. I guess, you know, I don't mean to dog on Crossrail. Any sort of urban infrastructure that's constructed, it feels like triage now, you know, like we're doing it to sort of work for 10 years and then we're gonna have another problem and we'll address that problem. I mean, this idea that we're gonna construct, you know, an infrastructural body that is going to last and it's gonna be, you know, it's gonna work when we move to having 10 million people using the system. It's kind of incredible, right? But I guess because of that, because of the scale of the thing, you know, at the time that it was built, everyone was totally fascinated by it. Like, what is happening? This felt like a new world was being constructed, you know? And in fact, it felt like a new body was being constructed. Like the kind of innards of London was actually being made. So I found this passage from 1862 from a guy called John Hollingshead, who was commissioned by Charles Dickens to go into the sewers 10 years after they were built and to bring back a report for Dickens' publication all the year round. And Hollingshead notes that inside the sewers, a piece of ordinary rust or moist red brick is soon pictured as a trace of blood. And while venturing into the drain under his house, he said that he wrote as if he felt the power had been granted to me of opening a trapdoor to my chest to look on the long-hidden machinery of my mysterious body. This is fascinating, right? This is like the urban circulatory system. Hollingshead is going into it, and he feels like in sort of seeing his own sewer, like dumping out into the main interceptor sewer, that he's actually seeing the functioning of the body, and it is causing him to reflect on his own body. So that relationship between subterranean infrastructure and bodies is not a fortuitous correlation. Nigel Thrift and Steve Graham wrote a paper called Out of Order, Understanding Repair and Maintenance in 2007, where one of the things they argue is that infrastructure under neoliberal regimes is meant to be invisible, or as Bruce Mao writes, absorbed into the background. But when the Fleet Ditch burst in 1862, this was the old Fleet River that was turned into a sewer, right? When the Fleet Ditch burst in 1862, flooding the new tube system, a reporter from the Illustrated Times suggested that the sewer was a broken artery, the burst veins gushing the city's innards into the street. So in addition to literary and historical accounts, we also have sociological accounts of sewer exploration. Henry Mayhew wrote a book in 1851 called London Labor and the London Poor, which I'm sure many of you will have encountered, where he describes the toshers, or sewer hunters, as people who entered the London sewers to explore them to any considerable distance in the search for tosh or anything made of copper. The authorities, for whatever reason, didn't like the sewer hunters going into the sewers then. And so a £5 reward was offered to anyone who informed on the toshers. So here's one of Mayhew's descriptions of their illicit wanderings under the city. Whenever they come near a street grating, they close their lanterns and watch for their opportunity of gliding silently past unobserved. For otherwise a crowd might collect overhead and intimate to a policeman on duty that there were persons wandering in the sewers below. So imagine that sort of, I'm going out with these urban explorers. We're popping manholes in the middle of the city. We're climbing down these manholes in the middle of the night. We're observing this incredible 150-year-old brick infrastructure. And then we're going under sewer gratings. We're covering our torches so that no one sees us in there. And then I'm going to Senate House Library the next day, and I'm reading passages of people doing this 150 years ago. It's a really cool moment of connecting to another time, right? During the construction of these sewers, the Victorian public seemed equally enthralled and frustrated by the public works taking place around them. As Paul Dobrozowitz writes, in the mid-19th century, sewers were almost a national obsession and were related to a host of concerns, some of them technical, but others that were moral, utopian, or even theological. However, many people also celebrated the arrival of a more modern age, which would lead to, they thought, emancipation from ill health and a reduction in manual labor through the efficiency of technology, right? This is always the promise of technology. We're going to work less, right? Whether it's infrastructure or, our iPhone. And then once the infrastructure is in place, of course, that never happens. In fact, it seems like we just end up working more and more. In any case. What was being constructed, some believed, was a better functioning urban body. Part of the allure of Subterranea, though, was also, of course, more conceptual. It was that the future was being built, right? And it felt like the construction of the future was taking place all around people. So people were really fascinated by this notion. But there's also a sense that, just like our photos, this is all very engineered, right? Bazalgette, as the engineer of the sewer system, he kind of has to sell people on this idea because people are also a little bit freaked out about what's happening. And so he does that by invoking this notion of the technological and urban sublime, right? Like these spaces become inhuman in scale, these massive excavations. So you can see this is a photograph that was published in the Illustrated London News in 1862, I think, of the Fleet sewer excavation. And you can see that they've got an old sewer pipe, right? So this is this is the previous age, and they have to very carefully dig around it to get down to modernity here at the bottom with the beautiful red brick, right? These kinds of illustrations obviously are doing very sort of calculated work on the public. So these images were both documentation of events and enticements to participation, because there were also opportunities for first-hand viewing in these sewers, where Bazalgette spun his sensory web. In 1861, he invited various London luminaries to see the sewers for themselves during tours, where he apparently delivered rousing speeches. It makes me imagine, right? Bazalgette with his mustache, standing on a platform giving speeches in the sewers. So this photo apparently depicts. So this photo is of people visiting the Southern Outfall, I believe, and apparently the Prince of Wales was actually in attendance here. So as Peter Ackroyd writes, even the sewer tunnels themselves, that was really important to people visiting the system to sort of sell them on the idea. And in 1862, William Webster, one of Bazalgette's subcontractors, actually hosted a dinner party in the sewers to celebrate the completion of a section. And at the event, as Fiona Rule describes, the immense circular pipeline had been given a temporary floor so that it resembled an extremely long arched crypt. The floor extended for a mile along the tunnel and was lit on either side by lamps, flickering against the red brickwork. So carefully, clearly this party had been engineered to leave a lasting impression. And this didn't go unnoticed because the press were invited to this party as well. And one of the journalists that was there said that the thousands of lamps were placed strategically in the archways to bring out the brickwork, and they were meant to overload the senses. And so he said that what he didn't see were that the play of the light on the bricks to him was actually conjuring up these sort of shadowy figures from the underground, you know, all these expectations people had about what was waiting for them when they started tunneling into the earth. It started coming to the fore when they put all of this light in. I also read an account, and I don't know, I've never actually verified this, but I read an account that when they started constructing the tube, people were concerned that sort of evil spirits were going to be released from tunneling into the earth. And so apparently they put bearded men at the entrances to the tunnels where the train came in, and this is supposed to somehow deflect the evil spirits or the bodyguards to the underworld or something. But anyway, you have to try and put yourself in the mindset of someone who's living in the mid-19th century, right? And that this is actually a really freaky proposition, that someone is digging all of this stuff out of the underground, right? So Bazalgette's having to work quite hard here to sell people on this idea. So photographs were also publicly circulating. Now keep in mind that photographs are a new technology at this time. So Bazalgette, he's working every angle, right? He's got drawings, he's placing ads, he's inviting people down, he's using photography, he's using all of these visual technologies of the time to try and sell people on what's happening here. So these photos, which apparently depict his workers hard at work in the sewers, obviously would have been long exposures. You know, these are going to be like 8 or 10-minute exposures, even in the middle of the day. So everyone is essentially standing here still to take these photos, which of course is exactly what we did in the first photo that I showed you of the sewer system. You know, we had to stand there for about 30 seconds rather than 10 minutes to get that exposure. But it's just as staged, right? This photography. So what I want to argue here is that through the physical act of the infrastructural overhaul, the deployment of new photographic and illustrative technologies documenting that process, and the large-scale distribution of such creations, a deeper understanding of Bazalgette's bricks, that sewer system, is in the assemblage of forms of affect meant to do exacting work on audiences. Right? This is no mistake. These are not accidents. However, just as with our photos, once we sort of take the photos and we put them out there, once they then enter the circulation, very often control is lost of that imagery. In the process of public engagement during the course of his architectural experiment, at taxpayers' expense, Bazalgette carefully engineered aesthetic assemblages. And while there certainly was an experiential element to his sales pitch, the most important component of the package was the effect. That is what was being created at this time. Manipulation of the senses here went hand in hand with the coordination of atmospheres and imaginaries that suggested a rather utopian, endless openness, a feeling that nothing would or should or could ever be the same. Right? The world was being rebuilt. Bazalgette was producing a new urban sensibility that he expected would overwhelm taboo, suspicions, and misgivings through a novel assemblage of technologies and bodies. So, this is where it gets really weird. So following Bakhtin again, in the same way that there can be no spatial encounter without temporal encounter, we also cannot take or view an image without encountering a constellation of tacit and explicit meanings. As Harriet Hawkins and I have written elsewhere, there's a potential here for a picturing of relationships between body and environment that, often working beyond the intentionality of the photographer, asserts less the particularities and more the very possibility of inhabiting or occupying urban space beyond, beside, and within forms presented to us for appropriate use. So there's a distinct and vital question here about audiencing, right? Like, who are these images being produced for? Where do they circulate? What kind of work do they do on audiences? And it's naive to think that these photographs are not taken with that intention in mind. Right? We knew exactly what we're doing when we're taking these things. And this is part of what I had to sort of, get these explorers to talk about during the process of this project, because even though we had moved from taking ruined photos to taking construction site photos and skyscraper and skyline photos into infrastructural tunnel systems, they were working in a long tradition of exploration photography, and they were aware of it. This is what's interesting. They didn't want to work through it, but they were totally aware of it, and they also were sort of flippant in their production of the images. Like, they were undermining the expectations of what explorer imagery should be by kind of mocking it, right? And at the same time replicating it. Now, here's where it gets really weird. So I was in the archive. So in 2012, we were doing a shoot for GQ magazine, and we took that photo on the left, and it's in the Fleet Junction. And then a couple of days later, I was in the archives digging through photographs, and I found that photo from 1956, which is very carefully framed in a very similar way. And just with the bodies in the image, it's the same junction. It's kind of a similar lens. There's similar lighting techniques used. And to be honest, it really freaked me out. Like, I had a shiver up the spine when I found the thing, because we didn't know that photo existed, right? And it felt like there was some sort of like unconscious replication of aesthetics that was happening here that actually was kind of beyond us, or we weren't quite comprehending. And I don't want to go so far as to say that the kind of, the affect or the history or the energy that's embedded in the actual bricks and the architecture sort of, affected us in a way that we took that photo. But it almost, when I think about Bakhtin's notion of the chronotope, about how, space can never escape time, I just feel like, well, there's a concrete example, right? It's right there in front of us. Like, human beings with camera technology go down into a sewer, and they just happen to stop at the same junction and produce a pretty similar photograph. So that's what I'm trying to sort of work through. Why does this stuff happen? So I'll just close here, and I want to leave time for questions. But I just want to close by saying that archaeology is the discipline most preoccupied with what lies beneath us. It's also a field that until relatively recently has been dominated by sort of non-urban work, and I think that there's an interesting crossover here with urban geographers who are also interested in stratigraphy that perhaps goes the opposite way, right? Where all of the newest layers are below. So as time progresses, you have to keep going deeper to keep tunneling into a city and building things. And obviously, as you keep digging, you keep encountering more bits of history. And I feel like there's an interesting intersection here that is not, we haven't quite explored yet. And maybe that's a particular prompt that we can work on. But I think that those intersections, if I can draw them out a little bit more, maybe hover around aesthetics, bodies, and materiality. And that perhaps these visualizations are a way of trying to sort of work through those things. From the ruins of disused sewage systems to the churning of subterranean space by tunnel boring machines, urban geographers like archaeologists and urban explorers spend more time with our thoughts below street level than anywhere else. So what I'd like to suggest is that the excavation of urban undergrounds as a sort of reverse archaeology has been accelerating since the 19th century in cities like London and Paris. And our key consideration is that, excavation is not just an archaeological praxis. It's a process that has led to layer upon layer of infrastructural crowding in the underground. It's a central concern to urban geography. Now, the problem that we have in cities is that we have these security concerns, which we can talk about more if you want to ask me about getting arrested or whatever, because that always happens. you know, I feel like we need to build more allies, because we're being increasingly excluded from these spaces under neoliberal regimes, right? We are not allowed to access them, we're not allowed to photograph them, and in fact, we're being prosecuted for doing so. And I feel like what we're actually losing there is perhaps a sort of rich body of documentation that are going to become the historical documentation that someone else in 150 years looks back to, you know, to think about what was happening in this time, in this space. And it's almost, I mean, I quite enjoy trespassing, I won't lie. But it's almost unfortunate that we have to go to such lengths to record this stuff, right? And that if we're actually caught in these spaces, you know, the consequences are quite severe. I think I'll leave it there and open it up for questions now, but thanks very much.
Thank you so much for an absolutely incredible lecture that I think opens up a lot of questions, especially that are percolating around after we went on a very fantastic tour with John Oxley, exploring our own York. But I would like to give everybody the opportunity, if you want to knit back and have another serving of wine as we ask questions, please feel free. But at this point, are there any opening questions? Liz?
The first very kind of practical question that occurs to me is, given the problems of access and like persecution for being seen as being a trespasser, have you not thought, is it possible just to approach authorities and say, this is what we're doing? We're kind of like new age archaeologists looking at new age archaeology or making. We want to have access to some of these sites because we can start documenting them in a really interesting way.
We've tried. To varying degrees of success. Abandoned buildings, sometimes we can get access to. I mean, Battersea Power Station has invited us in on various occasions to take photos, and then all of a sudden they realized that they could make money off of that, and they started asking for £2,000 a day to take photos. Transport for London is a similar situation. You have to go through, you have to pay an exorbitant fee, you have to get security clearances, you sort of have a minder with you. And new infrastructure like Crossrail, we never have a chance.
Okay.
The sewers, again, are very interesting because we've got this kind of symbiotic relationship with Thames Water where they know that we're going down there, but no one has ever been arrested in a sewer. We've never had any problems. And we sometimes anonymously call in leaks in the sewer, which is helpful for them. So, yeah, but I feel like, you know, if other kind of infrastructural authorities in London could take a lead from that, we'd actually be in a much more productive space. Because part of the problem, I think, you know, I mean, I didn't go into the politics of this very much, but one of the things that I've written a lot about is the fact that these are essentially public spaces, right? Like, this is taxpayer money constructing these spaces. And when you tell people, we're going to take your money and we're going to build this space, and you're not allowed in that space, it creates resentment and frustration that I think bubbles up in much more violent forms, you know. And actually, it would be healthy if they could actually trust citizens to just sort of, you know. So I'll give you a concrete example. In Brescia, Milan, near Milan, there was an urban explorer crew that was going into the old sewers, and they were looking for the original Roman sewers. And the city found out that they were doing this, and they contacted them and they said, hey, we've got a great idea. Here's the key to the sewer. You're responsible for it now, right? So they built a big party chamber under there, as you might expect. But they also, you know, take very good care of those sewers, and they make sure that everything is in good working order. And if there was anyone down there that had malicious intent, they would know immediately that someone is there because they're in the sewers all the time. So I think there are more productive ways of dealing with these situations.
Behind Steve, I think. I'm sorry, the blue shirt.
Yeah. Are you familiar with the tunnels around the Welbeck Abbey estate?
No.
So in Nottinghamshire, there are a massive network of tunnels which were built by the 5th Duke Portland, who was a really powerful aristocrat in the mid-19th century, and they were built by the London Underground engineers, and they are of the same size. And it's because he was completely bonkers, and he was a total recluse, and he wanted to be hidden and concealed at all times around his estate. I actually think he led a double life, and that's why he was doing it. And there was actually a case taken out against him as double life. But I've tried to get into those tunnels countless times of being kicked off the estate. It's a privately owned estate, so it's CCTV, the laser motion censored, and once you're on
I
the
can
estate,
help you with all those.
yeah. So the thing is, the tunnels are completely bricked up now, and they are the same size as the ones we're looking at there, and the underground tunnels. They're bricked up. We've still got the ventilation shafts on the roof, but I just wondered if you had any ideas, tips about how on earth to get in, and also, what you're talking about, what you're contributing by doing this. I just wondered what you feel that would contribute, apart from satisfy my own interest, which is massive. What do you think that would contribute to
Well, we can't have a conversation about what should be done with spaces until we know they're there, right? So I feel like it's a starting point for a conversation. That's all it's doing, and I feel like that's a lot. The work that urban explorers do when they post these photos online, it's mostly about starting a conversation. And those photos have led to, in some cases, buildings being listed or things being preserved. In other cases, there have probably been negative impacts, to be honest. So it's a bit hit and miss. But this notion of kind of amateur tunnel excavation I find really interesting, because there was the mole man in Hackney, William Little, who was excavating tunnels under his house and started to collapse the whole block. And there's also those tunnels in Liverpool, where I think there was a shortage of labor or something, and so a wealthy landowner employed people to build essentially tunnels that have no use. I like that idea, photographing tunnels that have no function. But it's nice to imagine sort of imagine a different life for these spaces, turn them into something else.
Steve?
I have a comment and a question. I mean, the comment is there's kind of dangers in drawing too easy a comparison, say, between your two photographs, isn't there? Because, when you said they look similar, to me, what struck me was you've got some guys who are visiting a place and you've got some other guys who are inspecting and maybe repairing and working in a place.
Yeah.
So there's some fault lines there as well. If I had to draw parallels between your work, and it would be with those Victorian middle-class visitors who are coming from outside, and being wowed by it or frightened or whatever they were. That experience might be very different from the people who actually constructed and maintained, and worked there, even in terms of their attitude towards spooky things beneath the ground. As a comment. And the question was, I was struck early on by you said you saw one of the things that you're doing, or the thing you're doing, as a rigorous form of documentation.
Yeah.
I wonder, can you say a bit more in what sense it's rigorous and therefore what its kind of objective might be analytically?
Yeah, so I was referring specifically there to explorers who go into ruins, and they go into and they take photos from the same location over a course of time. And so I know one photographer who went into and took a photo down a single corridor every season for, I think, 8 years. And so you can actually see the decay and collapse of the roof in the corridor, and then plants starting to grow out of the ground. I don't know what the point is of that documentation. Meticulous, it was very scheduled, and every time he snuck in to take that photo, he was putting himself at risk, right? So I guess it gets back to that notion of what do we do with all of this public interest, right? These people are going to incredible lengths to photograph these spaces and to share these spaces with everyone else. And instead of kind of mobilizing that and realizing, wow, we've got an incredible community of enthusiasts here that we could actually, put to work in doing some stuff, everyone gets slapped on the wrist and told to stop. So yeah, I don't, perhaps one answer here would be, if someone was going into a hospital and taking photos in that way, someone who works in preservation for the NHS might say, hey, can we use those photos? Or instead of doing that, can you do this? That would be.
I mean, might be nitpicking, but I guess my question would be, how do you know what rigour and sufficient rigour amounts to, unless you have some concept of what happens to them afterwards?
Well,
It's a bit of
keep
this,
it-
we say we throw them out there and people use them as they wish, which is fair enough. But you can't actually say, therefore, what constitutes sufficient rigour to count.
Yeah.
See what
I guess it's all relative, and what we're looking at in most of these cases is we're comparing it to no documentation at all,
well,
right?
yeah. Fair enough.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I was just wondering, obviously you've had a lot of bad experiences with the authorities in murders in these places. To what extent would you say some of this kind of, the no trespassing is benign in the kind of health and safety and security sense, and how much of it is just a sort of possessiveness for the spaces?
So about it being benign.
That was maybe the wrong word to use. But
No, yeah.
well,
No. I'm thinking back to when I was doing. I was in this lithic technology laboratory at UC Riverside with Phil Wilkie, and we were spending 10 hours a day making stone tools. And he said, we're committing suicide right now, right? We're going to die of silicosis of the lungs if we keep doing this. We're breathing obsidian dust all day long, right? It's the exact same situation with urban exploration. When I say that they put themselves at great risk, that's in multiple senses. They put themselves at great legal risk, but I've also been breathing a lot of asbestos for the past couple of years. I'm probably not going to live very long, to be honest. That's the price that explorers are willing to pay. I think that's actually important, right? Like, why are people willing to put themselves at such great risk? But I guess the other side of this is, so that's like personal risk, right? And then we've got this other kind of risk on a slightly different scale, where you think about, well, does an urban explorer running through tube tunnels at night, what does that mean for health and safety, right? What I can say is that they're very rigorous, again, in their understanding of how these infrastructures work. We have engineered track maps. If you can use keys, you get keys. It's sort of like, the hacker ethos is you always use the most sort of the simplest solution, right? Like if you can use a key and get through a door, you don't abseil down an air shaft. Some of these locations were incredibly difficult to get into, and took many months or years of work. And sometimes there were sort of like multiple layers of stuff that we're getting through. But very often we would get to a point where people would say, I think this isn't safe, or this could actually make someone else unsafe. Like if we open this and someone walks by and they climb in, this is going to be a problem. And then we would back out of it, So they're very caring in that way, but that actually didn't surprise me, because all of this comes out of love for the city. They're not, these are not like, evil people in ski masks running around doing criminal damage, which is what, TfL wanted everyone to believe. These are people who are really enthusiastic. They're like anoraks, who are really enthusiastic about infrastructure. The people who sit in the library, they work full-time jobs, and they go to the library on Saturday and they sit there reading about sewers all day long, and then go out, all night popping manholes and looking at them and photographing them. They're slightly obsessive and probably on the spectrum or whatever, but but they are benign as a group for the most part. Sorry, did that answer? There was a second question there that I dodged, wasn't there?
I guess what I was trying to ask was to what extent the prohibition of access is kind of well intended, so that people don't put themselves at risk, or to what extent you feel like, for example, with the Crossrail, that it's just about a kind of possessive attitude towards public spaces.
Yeah, I don't think it's well intended. I don't think it's about health and safety. I think it's about a kind of mindless bureaucratic process, and it's about profit. Like if you had to shut Crossrail down to show it to people, as they do during open house weekends, right? You look at the queues for open house weekend, people wanting to get in Crossrail, and I went to that, right? And it's full of urban explorers, those queues, because they like getting the authorized access too, But you can see that there's the public fascination has not changed over 150 years. Everyone wants to see it, but now it's not about building infrastructure for the public good, right? It's not about convincing the public that this is a worthy investment of their tax money. Now it's putting these contracts out to bid. It goes to the lowest bidder. They're on a very tight timeline. They don't have time to stop and show people this, and they don't really care whether you like it or not, because it's going to happen anyway. It's a very different culture. I guess what I'm saying in a sense is, like, 150 years ago, this obviously wasn't necessary. I mean, Hollingshead, when he went down into the sewers in 1860 or whatever, may have asked someone, or he may have just thought, well, like, obviously you can just go in them, it's public infrastructure, whereas now we see it as threatening or whatever. So it's just a different political climate.
We're going to take one more question, and oh gosh, this we've been waiting for a while.
All right, thank you. Just to sort of turn this on its head, is there a risk of potentially jeopardizing people's alternative use for these spaces? So I suppose an extreme example would be a homeless community taking up residence in an abandoned building. Urban explorers go in, the authorities then go into this, they close it up or make the penalties stricter. So by doing, by documenting, is there a risk of jeopardizing a functional social use for these places? Have you come across that? Yeah.
It's always, you don't know what the outcome is going to be from exposing these spaces. I will say that in the UK, I've never encountered someone living in these spaces or using them, right? So the danger here is always that some property developer is going to see the photos and think, oh, that's a great investment. And that's actually happened a few times. One of the World War II bunkers that we got into in Clapham North, was, again, it was empty for, since the war, I guess. Like, there was nothing in there, and then we put the photos online, and then suddenly someone turned it into an underground herb farm, which is kind of a cool use of it, to be honest, because it doesn't really affect the the infrastructure of the architecture. But there's another person from the old London Underground company who has who's put forward proposals, which Boris Johnson is really a fan of, to turn all of the abandoned tube stations into nightclubs and bars. And I think Brompton Road was sold to him. So it was sold. Brompton Road station is on the Piccadilly line next to South Kensington. And it's a beautiful station. It's got the original pre-war tiling on the walls. And it's been used, I think it's been, the RAF owned it for a long time. They're doing training exercises in there or something, but it was sold for, I think, 156 million last year, and we don't know who the buyer is. I bet you anything it's that guy. And, it's going to turn into a nightclub. Whether that would have happened if we didn't sort of release the photos, I don't know. But in those more extreme circumstances, in Las Vegas, for instance, when I was exploring the flood channels there, I found about 300 people living in the storm drains in Las Vegas. And in those instances, it's not about exploration anymore, right? Because you're in somebody's house. But what you can do is you can sort of raise awareness on those issues or not, and decide that actually it's better if no one knows about that. But as I say, most explorers are pretty respectful about these issues, and would never, I think, put anyone in jeopardy for their explorations, unlike some other explorers in history.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to go to the three-legged mare afterwards if you'd like to have a drink in the pub. But otherwise, avail yourselves of the rest of the wine. And thank you very much for coming. Thanks, Brad.
Thanks, everyone.